Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. It's been quite a while since we've taken a look at any history from the East End of London. Now, as those of you who are regulars here on the channel might already know, my academic specialism is in the early modern period. However, over time, I have developed a special interest in both women's history and also in the history of the East End. In fact, on that note, I have got quite a few videos that I would like to make on these particular areas of historical study. So do look out for those in the future. But let's return to today's topic. Rather ideally, it's going to allow me to combine my two areas of special interest, women's history and the history of the East End. Today, we're going to look at the life and legacy of, in my opinion, brilliant woman. Someone who had a strong connection to the East End and to its history. So, let's take a look at the life and legacy of Annie Besant. Some of you may be familiar already with the area around Bow Church in London, but for those of you who are not, the Bow Church of which I am speaking is not the home of those famous Cockney-making Bow bells. They are elsewhere. Instead, this Bow Church is where, among other things, the Bryant and May match factory used to stand. The buildings still stand, as we can see, but today the complex is being used for housing. However, in the summer of 1888, this complex of buildings was the backdrop for the so-called Matchgirls strike. I will leave my video on that particular event linked, but for today's purposes, suffice it to say, this strike was a massively significant event in the history of the union movement, because this represented the very first time that unskilled women would successfully unionise and take strike action in Britain. Within weeks, they would achieve their aims, and there would be changes to both their pay and conditions. Their success in this action would go on to inspire other unions for generations to come, with the Great Dock Strike of the following year being a key example of this. Indeed, the strength of dockers' unions is today, I would argue, internationally recognised. If you've ever wandered past the old match factory, perhaps you were able to spot the plaques that have been placed on the exterior wall of the complex. There is an English Heritage blue plaque placed there fairly recently to mark the site of the match factory and to name it as the location of the strike. There is a similar plaque that was placed there for the Bow Historic Trail series. And until fairly recently, there was also a plaque that read, quote, "The Matchgirls strike of 1888 was led here by Annie Besant, journalist and lecturer, 1847 to 1933. Following the strike, Annie Besant became the secretary of the new Matchmakers' Union. In 1917, she became the president of the Indian National Congress and was also international president of the Theosophical Society from 1907 to 1933. Well, as accolades go, that is quite the list of achievements. And while we will be challenging one of these claims, I would imagine that you can understand why this figure piqued my interest, as I'm sure she will have done for many of you as well. Annie was the second child and first daughter to be born to William Perce Wood and his wife Emily. Annie was born in London on the 1st of October 1847. Annie's parents had met and married in Dublin, where William was studying medicine at Trinity College. But when the couple moved to London, William found work in the city as an underwriter. The couple would have 3 children, but it would only be Annie and her elder brother Henry who would survive. Annie was just 5 when her father died, and to make ends meet and to help support Henry's education at the prestigious Harrow School, their mother Emily offered boarding for students at Harrow at a house that she rented nearby for the purpose. When Annie was around 9, due to the complexities of boarding all of these boys, her mother sent her to Dorset to live with and be educated by Ellen Marryat. She was a wealthy, unmarried family friend. In addition to lessons in subjects such as Latin, French, geography and history, Annie would be heavily influenced by the evangelical faith of her host. Annie would live with Ellen until she was 16, at which point she returned to Harrow. Anne Taylor explains that, quote, "When Miss Marryat dismissed her, she was intensely devout. In her own words, the very stuff of which fanatics were made. She was prevented from converting to Roman Catholicism only by a prior commitment to the Oxford movement. This refers to the 19th century faith movement, which was connected to the University of Oxford, that hoped to revive certain Roman Catholic doctrines within the Church of England." On the 21st of December 1867, when Annie was 20, she was married. Her husband was the Reverend Frank Besant. Children soon followed. Arthur Digby was born on the 16th of January 1869, followed by Mabel Emily on the 28th of August 1870. Little Mabel would fall dangerously ill the following year, in 1871. In fact, she became so ill that she very nearly died. And as far as Annie was concerned, this was desperately unjust. So unjust, in fact, that the stalwart faith of her youth was shaken, irreversibly, as it would turn out. Because Annie soon began to consort with the religiously unorthodox. In 1827, she was published, not in her own name, but as, quote, "the wife of a beneficed clergyman." The text that she had written would, in certain circles, have been viewed as incendiary, because it was on the deity of Jesus of Nazareth. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there was soon a rift in the Besant marriage. The couple would obtain a deed of separation, which was dated to the 29th of October 1873. This deed placed their son Arthur in the custody of his father, with visitation permitted by his mother, while their daughter Mabel was placed with her mother full-time. This deed also specified that Annie should receive a small maintenance allowance from Frank. Annie moved to London in the following year, 1874. There, she secured a role as a writer for the National Reformer in 1875. Before long, she would also develop a reputation as an eloquent and compelling public speaker. She had the capacity to draw a large crowd. In fact, George Bernard Shaw called her, quote, "the greatest orator in England, possibly in Europe." The National Reformer was run by Charles Bradlaugh. He was also the founder and president of the National Secular Society. Over the next few years, Annie and Charles's working relationship flourished. The pair would go on to establish the Free Thought Publishing Company on the 20th of January 1877. In the March of that year, they would republish Charles Naughton's The Fruits of Philosophy, which had originally been published in 1832. The Fruits of Philosophy is a treatise on birth control. This republication drew the interest of the authorities, who soon determined that Annie and Charles should be prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act of 1857 for their work in this matter. When they went to trial, Annie would speak in her own defence, but also in defence of the value of educating the general public on the manners of birth control that might be available. I have no doubt that Annie's own experience of being a relatively young wife with 2 small children and a fear that having a third would stretch the family finances into poverty could only have helped to strengthen her resolve. Annie and Charles were risking a prison sentence on account of these charges, but both were ultimately acquitted. This experience, though, clearly did little to deter Annie, who would produce her own text on contraception, called The Law of Population, in the very next year, 1878. Although she had been acquitted in a court of law, the same could not be said for the court of public opinion. And I think we can all recognise that even today, the court of public opinion does exist, does hold power and frequently is much less forgiving when it comes to perceived transgressions. For many members of the public, Annie had proven herself to be scandalous. As a result, her estranged husband would argue that she had shown herself to be unfit to raise their daughter Mabel, or indeed to have any access to either of her children. Frank would be successful in having their established custody arrangement modified in this way. It would be a number of years before Annie would be back in either of her children's lives. Against the backdrop of this personal crisis, and indeed over the next 20 years, Annie's publication, The Law of Population, reportedly, quote, sold 175,000 copies in England, had been reprinted in the United States and Australia, and had been translated into German, Dutch, Italian and French, making it among the most widely circulated tracts on contraception in its time. Annie threw herself into her work, education and activism. She would write to decry the actions of the British government in Ireland. She would spend time as a student of science at the London University. Then, at the start of the 1880s, Charles Bradlaugh, her dear friend and associate, was elected to serve as the Member of Parliament for Northampton. However, he would run into problems when it came to him actually being able to take up this seat. He had asked, on account of his atheism, to be able to affirm his allegiance rather than to swear it. This would have taken God out of the equation, so to speak. But this request was blocked, and so Charles agreed to swear. But then he also publicly stated that despite the fact he was going to swear an oath, he would view himself as being bound to it in the same manner as if it had been an affirmation, rather than the oath that it was in fact going to be. Many members of the House saw this public statement as a provocation. The back and forth over Charles taking this oath, and thus his seat legally, would rumble on until 1886, and if you're keeping count, that is 6 years. During this period, he was barred from entering the House. Nevertheless, he did go in, and thus he was removed by the police and was even taken into custody. However, he did on occasion manage to vote. Some would view this as being an illegal vote, and thus he would be fined. Annie was involved in this struggle. Soon, though, Annie and Charles would come to diverge ideologically. Charles was a member of the Liberal Party, which at the time was being led by William Gladstone, who in addition to being party leader, was also Prime Minister. Annie would come to view the Liberal Party as a repressive force. As a result, she had begun to investigate socialism. She would come to ally herself with the socialists and would behave accordingly. This position, these behaviours, would soon become too radical for Charles. Before long, in 1885, Annie was part of the executive of the Fabian Society. She would offer her support to a relatively new political party called the Social Democratic Federation. She also engaged in civil disobedience. On the 13th of November 1887, Annie would lead a march beginning in the East End of London and going to Trafalgar Square. Trafalgar Square had been officially closed to demonstrations and demonstrators on account of an order that had been given by the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. It is said that on this occasion, Annie was very much hoping that she would be arrested. In this way, she could use her fame, or perhaps that should be her notoriety, to draw greater attention to her cause, to the cause of the demonstration. She was said to be very upset to have been recognised by police officers and thus removed from the area. However, whether she would admit it or not, this was no doubt very lucky for her, because the police would break up this demonstration with such a degree of violence that it came to be known as Bloody Sunday. Now, of course, I'm aware that lots of days do carry that name. This is one of them. Before long, Annie joined the Law and Liberty League. This league published a journal called The Link, and Annie was made the editor of it. In the summer of 1888, Annie got word about the state of the working conditions at the Bryant and May match factory. As a result, she went down there, with leaflets in hand. Those leaflets pointed out that Annie was looking for workers who would be willing to be interviewed anonymously by her to tell her about their experiences. The results of these inquiries can be seen in her article, which was published in the link on the 23rd of June 1888. The article carried the title White Slavery in London. It detailed the unsafe, unfeeling and poorly paid condition in which these match workers, who were mostly very young women, found themselves to be working. The factory responded by trying to root out and fire any possible troublemakers that might potentially have blown the whistle, so to speak, in this way. But as a result of these firings, and also the pressure that other workers were being put under by those higher-ups at the factory to provide statements that might counter Besant's article, around 1,400 match workers walked out on strike. This was not the first time that the match workers had gone on strike. Of course, I think it's clear to see that it is the best remembered, and in part, that is because it's the best publicised. And this publicity is only helped by the fact that this strike ends in victory. Annie's article, or at least the response to Annie's article by those in charge at Bryant and may have been the catalyst for this strike breaking out. Annie's continued reporting on the strike no doubt fixed it as a moment to be remembered for posterity. However, and despite the wording of that old blue plaque, Annie Besant did not lead this strike. The matchwomen organised themselves. They initiated this strike as they had done before. It had no single leader. With that being said, Annie's publication, The Link, did launch a successful appeal to bolster the strike fund for the match workers, to fund them as they were on strike. And undoubtedly this would have helped matters because it reduced the financial imperative for them to capitulate. They could continue to fight to have their demands met, which they did successfully. The first meeting of the Union of Women Matchmakers was held on the 27th of July 1888. At this meeting, Annie was elected to be the union's first secretary. By the end of the year, they had expanded to include and recognise the men of their profession. They became the Matchmakers' Union. In 1889, the year after the strike, Annie was elected to the London School Board. She had run as the socialist candidate for Tower Hamlets. But while all of this was going on, Annie was evidently developing a keen interest in the esoteric religious movement which had organised itself into the Theosophical Society. Indeed, Annie would become the pupil of Madame Blavatsky, who was that society's founder. And it seems that Annie was greatly influenced by her. For example, Madame Blavatsky held fairly well publicised and negative views about birth control. She deemed it to be something that interrupted the process of reincarnation. Seemingly, this then altered Annie's own opinion on the matter. Annie's former colleague and friend, Charles Bradlaugh, died on the 30th of January 1891. And although their relationship had certainly become strained due to their differing paths in matters of politics and faith, Annie was bereft at his loss. But the loss would not stop there. Annie's spiritual mentor, Madame Blavatsky, died in the May of the same year. 2 years later, in 1893, Annie finished work on her autobiography. She also travelled to India to fulfil her, as she saw it, calling to serve the principles of Theosophy. She would eventually become the Society's president. During her time in India, among other things, Annie founded the Central Hindu College. She produced a translation of the Bhagavad Gita. She continued to write and lecture on a variety of topics that were both relevant and indeed pressing for people in both Britain and in India. She would, for example, respond fiercely and furiously to the news of the violent suppression of the Dublin Easter Rising, which took place in 1916. This was a revolt against British rule in Ireland, and it was part of a growing push for home rule in Ireland. Annie joined the Indian National Congress in 1913, and in 1915 she argued for the formation of Home Rule leagues across India. And she was doing all of this while wearing traditional Indian dress, albeit in white, which is the Hindu colour for mourning. By doing so, she was affirming that she was in a kind of mourning due to the evils of British rule in India. In 1917, Annie became the first woman to be the president of the 32nd Indian National Congress meeting, which took place at Calcutta. This represented the very zenith of her influence. After this point, that influence would diminish. Annie found herself to be at odds with Gandhi, as she denounced his method of passive resistance. Nevertheless, in the remaining decades of her life, Annie continues to attend political and diplomatic meetings that are attempting to deal with the future of India, to try and determine just what that might look like. Annie also travelled the world due to her role as the president of the Theosophical Society. Some of these globe-trotting trips were made using a relatively new form of transport, the aeroplane. During her last years, Annie went into retirement as her health declined. During this period, she was cared for diligently in Adia. Annie died on September the 20th, 1933. She was 85 years old. So what do you think of Annie Besant, of her life and her legacy? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. But I would also really love it if you would consider popping an emoji, or as we are now calling them, a social glyph in the comments too. Because the more engagement that a video gets, the more that YouTube realises people like it, and thus the more they share it out, which will help us to grow this community. I think that we've covered quite a bit in today's video. There's been quite a few topics touched upon, and thus I'd be fascinated to know which emoji springs to mind in relation to this video for you. I am looking forward to seeing those in the comments. Do let me know. You can also find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope that you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, why not share it with your friends? In fact, if you like the channel generally, you should tell some pals about it. You can let me know that you liked this video in particular by hitting the thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel. If you think you're subscribed, now's the time to have a check. Just have a little look. Make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you against your will. And while you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, why don't you hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that will appear so that YouTube will tell you, allegedly, when I've next uploaded or when I'm going to be going live. I hope that you have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.